My name's Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Foley Institute and on behalf of our co-host for today's event, the Murrow College of Communication, I want to welcome you out to our symposium. This is actually our 5th annual Media and Politics Symposia that we've held. Former symposia have looked at the role of media in shaping civil discourse, the role of media in online democracy, the role of infotainment programs, and last year our symposium examined the role of media in political polarization. Today's symposium is going to examine how new forms of social media have played a role in the political transformation of the Arab world. As many of you know, the uprisings in 2011 in Tunisia and later in Egypt, which later sort of blossomed into what we call the Arab Spring, I suppose now, were fueled in large part by new forms of social media like Facebook and Twitter. These new forms of social media allowed citizens to express their discontent with their government and to organize against entrenched political powers. And so we have a distinguished panel to talk about these developments today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to one of the panelists who will also be our moderator. That's Dean Larry Pintak. Our first speaker today will be Dean Freelon. Deen is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at American University. His research focuses on the changing relationship between technology and politics and how political communication relates to citizen expression. Dr. Freelon has also worked extensively on the use of computer programming to extract and analyze online data. He created Recal, an online recoder reliability application that has been used by thousands of researchers around the world. And he formerly served as a technology trainer, a web designer, and multimedia consultant at Duke University. Dr. Freelon will be followed by David Faris. And David Faris is an assistant professor in the political science department and the director of the International Studies program at Roosevelt University. Dr. Faris spent 1.5 years in Cairo conducting interviews with activists, journalists, and students for his recently published book entitled Dissent and Revolution in a Digital Age, Social Media, Blogging, and Activism in Egypt. He is currently working on 2 other book projects, one examining social media and public diplomacy in the Middle East generally, and the other an edited book focusing on social media in Iran. Finally, we have Larry Pintak. Larry is the Dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication here at WSU. A former Middle East correspondent for CBS News, he has been called the foremost expert on the interaction between Arab and Western media. His books and articles focus on America's relationship with the Muslim world and the role of media in government policy, as well as the future of journalism in the digital and globalized world. He has won 2 Overseas Press Club awards and has twice been nominated for international Emmys. Prior to coming to WSU, Dean Pintak served as the director of the Center for Journalism Training and Research at the American University in Cairo. Please join me now in welcoming our panelists.
Thanks to all of you for coming. My role today is mainly to listen to these guys and have a little conversation afterwards. I will, though, share, since we're talking about Twitter and social media in the Middle East, I was looking at my Twitter feed today, and one of my more recent books, about 2 or 3 years ago, was called The New Arab Journalist, and it was just before the Arab uprising. And there was a tweet from someone in the Arab world who said, a tweet to me saying, are you going to do a follow-up? Now that so many things have changed, it makes sense that you do another book on Arab journalism. And that was a few days ago. And I saw in my Twitter feed today a tweet from someone else in the Arab world saying, referring to that tweet, saying, "He will not write again!" exclamation. So I'm still digesting quite what that means. Dean, if we can start with you, as you wander up, I'll give a little context. Deen was involved in a meta-analysis of tweets during the Arab Spring that used the bit.ly functionality that shortens links. And they analyzed, about 5 or 10 million clicks off of these links. And the headline from that, if I don't steal your thunder, was that new media was the conduit for old media during the Arab Spring. increasingly providing media for the old media, information for the old media, but not in and of itself the driver of social change. So with that, what do you have to say about all that?
So can you see the PowerPoint? I don't, is that somewhere?
Where did Richard go?
I don't know, he disappeared for a second. I don't know
We're
if it's
not
up on the
seeing
screen.
anything, sir.
Oh, okay, so I can say some other things while this is appearing. Okay, so something's happening, that's great. Yeah, so that is true. I actually won't be talking about that today. I'll be talking more specifically about a project that my colleagues and I are doing that focuses specifically on Syria. So the project that Larry's talking about was on the Arab Spring more generally. We focus on 4 different countries. This one focuses exclusively on Syria. And so for this one, I'm going to bring a combination of network analysis and some qualitative analysis to look at global perceptions of the Syrian conflict as refracted through Twitter. And so that should be pretty exciting as soon as this comes up. Yeah, so I guess, well, before I get to the substance of my talk, I really should acknowledge my collaborators. This is work that's done primarily with 2 other collaborators, both of which who are at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. They are Mark Lynch, who's a Middle East expert, and Sean Aday, who's an expert in public diplomacy and international media. And our work is funded by the U.S. Institute of Peace, whose mandate is to reduce global conflict. And yeah, we also have recently released a report of our findings that are based on Syria, and that just came out in January. So if you're interested in what I'm talking about today, then you should go to the URL that is on this page right here and download that. And I'll show that again at the end. So this is the successor report to the one that Larry mentioned. So this talk is sort of a standard academic talk. I'm just going to talk about some theory first, and some data and some results, then get to discussions and implications. This is condensed from a longer talk, so if anything doesn't make sense, please be sure to write it down and I'll explain it adequately during Q&A. Okay, so the main sort of theoretical jump off point for this is, so it goes by a number of names. So there's audience fragmentation, filter bubbles, echo chambers, cyber balkanization, and others. And that sounds like something that one of your previous panels focused on. And so these ideas all share the same core contention that internet users will use digital filtering tools to overwhelmingly consume ideologically consistent content at the expense of ideologically challenging content. And so fragmentation is of course expected to get more extreme over time as people grow increasingly comfortable in the absence of inconvenient truths to threaten their worldviews. But we know from this research that although people do tend to seek out ideologically congenial information, they're by no means isolated completely from alternative opinions. So those are 2 different mechanisms there. But one of the things that really motivated us to study Syria was that most of the conclusions drawn about fragmentation are drawn from studies that are about the advanced democracies in the West. And so that's one of the main reasons that we wanted to focus on Syria in this particular study. So at this point, Syria has seen the most violence of any country associated with the Arab Spring. Initially peaceful protests staged in March 2011 were followed by violent government reprisals, and the country slowly descended into all-out civil war, which began on July 29th, 2011 with the formation of the Free Syrian Army, whose express purpose was to remove President Bashar al-Assad from power. The conflict has claimed over 100,000 lives, displaced millions, and unfortunately continues to this day with no end in sight. Nearly everything most people outside of Syria know about what's going on inside of Syria comes from some form of media. And so the question about how information gets out of Syria and to the rest of the world centrally implicates media, and in particular, social media. This is in part due to the fact that Syria is one of the most, if not the most, socially mediated conflicts in the entire world, with massive amounts of text and video data streaming in and out of the country on a daily basis. And because the situation on the ground is so volatile, there's no reason to assume that the flow of online information or the attention patterns of online audiences will remain static. And finally, we don't know what the major differences will be between Arabic-speaking audiences and English-speaking audiences. Multilingual research into online fragmentation, and indeed the Arab Spring itself, is actually still pretty rare, especially when you're talking about research that addresses social media. So to bring all this together, I have a few research questions that I'm going to explore with some Twitter data that we gathered. I also got a couple of hypotheses here. So the first one is that the Syria Twitter conversation will exhibit a highly fragmented structure as a whole, firstly. Secondly, we predict that individual communities within this conversation will grow more and more insular over time. And then our two research questions are, firstly, how will Arabic-speaking communities differ from English-speaking communities in terms of fragmentation? We're actually not going to talk about mouse self-communication today, but so you can ignore those last 4 words. And then finally, what factors will account for changes in fragmentation over time? So that's a lot to do. I'm going to try to get through this relatively quickly. Data-wise, we obtained 57.7 million tweets from a data vendor called Topsy, which was recently acquired by Apple. And so these tweets were every single tweet that contained either the term Syria in English or in Arabic from January 1st, 2011 through August 31st, 2013. And that in total was 57.7 million tweets over the span of 32 months. And what's really interesting about that is not the size per se, but the completeness of that data set, right? So we were able to access every piece of data that was relevant in sort of a very baseline way in terms of mentioning either of those terms. Now, we focused in this study on retweets, and so 44% of that 57.7 million, or 25,383,627 tweets were retweets. And so the reason why we focus on retweets is that retweets act as social signifiers of attention. In other words, we assume that what people retweet reveals what they're paying attention to, regardless of whether or not they agree with it, right? So there's all sorts of debates about whether retweets indicate agreement or endorsement, but we don't rely on those kinds of assumptions. We assume only that retweets indicate what people are attending to. And so it follows from that assumption that people with similar retweeting patterns also share similar information environments. In other words, so the technical term for this is they belong to the same epistemic community, so the same groups of people who share similar frames of informational reference. Okay, so, and with that assumption, I can actually move on to a very quick method slide here that describes the workflow of how I did this. So the data came from Topsy. We moved those, they came as flat text files, CSVs, if you are aware of that format, and then we moved those into a MySQL database. After that, I created some smaller files consisting only of the retweets and moved all the way down there to the bottom, analyzing those computationally with a Python module of my own design called TSM, which stands for Twitter Subgraph Manipulator. I can talk more about the methodological guts of that during Q&A if you'd like. And then with the pre-processed data that came out of TSM, both myself and my colleague Mark Lynch, who was an Arabic speaker, which I am not, did some qualitative analysis of that output, and then finally we moved on to some visualization, which I'll go ahead and show you right now. So this is just a very basic plot of the retweets in English and Arabic. So one of the things that this really shows is that in the early days of the Arab Spring, if you look down here, you can see that English and Arabic were sort of at parity in terms of the number of retweets that they produced. But pretty soon after that, by about July, August, the number of Arabic retweets begins to regularly outstrip the number of English language retweets. And so even though those peaks and valleys are pretty well correlated, the correlation is actually not perfect. You can see that there are some events that resonate much more strongly among Arabic language audiences than they do among English-speaking audiences. And so unsurprisingly, we see English and Arabic upticks at times when circumstances evolve the West, but much more pronounced Arabic language upticks for major military events. So you can see that when Obama calls for Assad to step down, the US shuts down the Syrian embassy. There are some very marked English and Arabic upticks there. And at the end, with the incidents about Assad using chemical weapons and Obama threatening a military strike on Syria, also major English upticks there. But then for these two central incidents, the Hula massacre and the Tresfa massacre, both internal to Syria, there are major spikes of Arabic language attention, but not attendance spikes in English language attention there. So from this, we can move on to talking about some of the hypotheses. So this So the first thing we predicted was that this data set would manifest a highly fragmented structure. So to test this, I used TSM to algorithmically identify the top 10 largest retweet communities by node count in each month. So nodes are just retweeting users. And so this created a total of 320 communities. That's 10 communities per month, 32 months. And so this is a plot of the average percentages of nodes and edges. Edges are just retweet relationships, so one person retweeting another. Accounted for by the top 10 communities in each month. And the algorithmic process creates a very large number of very small communities and a very small number of very large communities. And so the error bars just extend 2 standard deviations above and below the mean point, capturing over 95% of node and edge percentages. And so what this shows is that in the vast majority of months, using the top 10 communities is highly economical. So the people cluster into those top 10 communities, and in the rest of the communities, they're very, very thin on the ground. And so we can clearly see that most users' retweet patterns in this case reveal a tendency to fragment into a very small number of very large communities there. So yeah, that's one finding in our favor at this point, but we still don't know how the overall level of fragmentation of the network changes over time. So to measure this, I calculated a very simple coefficient called the EI index for all 10 communities across all 32 months. So the EI index simply means that so the EI index is actually down here. When the line goes low, that means increasing fragmentation. It's sort of counterintuitive. And when the line goes higher, it means that fragmentation is actually lessening in severity. But I should actually need to explain the top of this first. So the top half actually represents the proportion of communities in each month that are primarily English language or Arabic language. And you can see here that after the initial Arab Spring, the top 10 communities are primarily in Arabic. So this flat line up here just means that 9 out of 10 were in Arabic, and down here correspondingly 1 out of 10 is in English. And this means 2 out of 10 are in English and 8 out of 10 are in Arabic. So that's what that means. It just means that after about June or July 2011, then the vast majority are in Arabic. And so what you see is that as the proportion of Arabic communities increase, we see borders between communities weaken as members begin to retweet outsiders with a fair degree of frequency. But as the proportion of English clusters decreases, ultimately falling to a low of 1, here we see that that English language community is actually quite insular. And this trend actually continues until the very end in August 2013, which was the month when Obama, of course, publicly debated a military strike on Syria. And so when that happened, so then it became big news, right? So several other English-speaking communities popped up, and then the one English community that was pretty lonely in most of these months over here was able to engage with a larger number of English-speaking communities, and there was a little bit less fragmentation going on there. And so with all those communities, they could sort of branch out a bit more. So yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting finding. There's a lot more of this that I don't have time to show, but I did want to show you what these communities actually look like. This is the major English language community that was the most robust throughout the entire data set. And if you look at the names of the people Twitter accounts that were in this community, I'm sure you can see a very clear trend here. So this is a journalist-driven community, an English-speaking journalist-driven community. You can see that there's, you've got Reuters, New York Times, CNN, BBC, Sky News, which is British, Washington Post, very firmly driven by journalists. And so this is what it looks like in March 2011, and we can move forward to take a look at what it looks like by June 2013. So I developed an algorithm to match communities and identify the same communities over time, and so this is over 2 years later. We can see that there's a lot of continuity here. So you've got Reuters, Foreign Policy, Huffington Post, BBC again, Al Jazeera, English is down here. And then you also have some new entrants here, again, all of whom are English speakers. You've got Rand Paul, George Galloway, a British politician, some crazy people like Alex Jones, who's a conspiracy theorist, the White House's account here. But overall, you can see that they're all part of a very similar kind of news and politics, primarily based in the United States, but also some that are out from outside of that. And the continuity is very clear there. So let's move on to discussion. I don't want to take too much time up here. So I can show you some of the hypotheses and research questions, how these turned out. So the Syria Twitter conversation was indeed highly fragmented, right? So they've tended to cluster into these a very small number a small number of very large communities rather than being very evenly distributed. Secondly, English-speaking communities did grow more insular over time, but Arabic-speaking communities did not. And we'll talk a little bit about why that happened in just a minute. And then in terms of the factors that account for these changes in fragmentation over time, we've got three that I'll talk about. So that's language, technology adoption, and the periodic nature of major events. So when it comes to language, I mean, so on a certain level, this is somewhat obvious, right? People who don't speak the same language aren't going to be able to communicate, but that's something that speaks to the importance of multilingual research in this area. So studies that only look at the English side of this equation are going to miss a lot of what's going on. And also there's the point that social media hasn't really improved as much as we might like on the propensity of people in different linguistic communities to communicate with one another, because we saw a very strong degree of fragmentation and separation rather of the greatest degree was between people who spoke different languages. So that hasn't quite, that bridge hasn't quite been bridged by social media quite yet. Factor two is tech adoption. One thing that I didn't talk about quite as much as I should have is the fact that over the time period of this study, Arabic language use of Twitter really exploded and increased a lot. At one point, it was actually the fastest growing language on Twitter. I don't know whether it still is. So what that means is that more Arabic speakers loosen borders among Arabic communities. It just makes sense. If you've got more people in your language to talk to, then that's going to open up the possibility of the borders between your communities loosening up. At the same time as that happened, Western interest in Syria sort of decreased, and so you had one community or two in many months that were talking about this in English, and so those tended to be very isolated from one another. And so this suggests that the greater variety of same language communities that are talking about a given topic, the more potential for community overlap that there is. Finally, the third relevant factor is time. It's well known that tweets and other social media activities tend to spike around major events, but what has not been documented until now is how the appearance of such events can influence online fragmentation. So the time period of the study encompasses the Arab Spring at the beginning and Obama's public consideration of a military strike on Syria at the end. And so during these two events, Western observers paid a lot more attention to Syria than they did otherwise. And now all that additional attention occasioned a loosening of community boundaries around these English-speaking communities. And so this underscores the general point that while fragmentation may be the general rule among certain communities, major events can bring people together who speak the same language to talk about the issue, at least temporarily. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop there, because I don't want to take up too much time, but I can talk about more of this during Q&A if you would like, and yeah, looking forward to that. Thank you.
David? Stuff. That's always scary.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank WSU and the Foley Institute and the Murrow College for bringing us here today. It's my honor to speak with you about these things. And I'm actually really, really sorry that I brought the Chicago weather with me. I promise it'll go away when I leave, which will be tomorrow morning. So I'm going to do something a bit different, which is I'm going to focus on the Egyptian uprising in 2011. And what I'm going to try to do is historicize it a bit. Okay, there's been a lot of attention, I think, on this 1 month period in January 2011, and the role of digital media, social media in particular, in that uprising. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us back in time a little bit to the early 2000s and take a look at what were the factors that led to this group of largely young people getting people out into the streets and then sort of kind of overthrowing the government. And then, this is a new addition to the talk in the last year, which is why did they all fail? That is why has authoritarianism returned with such vigor to Egyptian politics, and try to answer the question of, if digital media played a role in the uprising, why have they been unable to sustain that success in the few years after the uprising? So I have some answers that I'm working out in my brain. Hopefully you can agree with them. So we're going to take a big step back. Okay, this is 11 years ago. And this is kind of when I date the start of Egyptian digital activism. Okay, this chart here represents the sum extent of my expertise in graphic design. So I definitely chose the right career, I think, for sure. I just use little PowerPoint circles. It's really fun. Back in 2003, Egypt is, of course, a highly authoritarian country with very tightly controlled, rigid censorship in the state-controlled media. And at the time, no real independent voices in the media at all. Okay? And a couple things happened in 2003 that I think are really interesting. Okay? One of them is you started to see the growth of a blogging community. Okay? That is a group of people largely centered in Cairo who would start their own pages. Remember back in the olden timey days when everybody was on Blogspot, right? So everybody was on Blogspot or like WordPress or whatever, and it's like your page, and it's like my thoughts about politics, right? But which is something, nobody does that anymore, really. But it was really revolutionary for Egypt, right? Because there was no other way at the time to publicly express your preferences about politics in a way that was true and honest, unless you sold your soul to Al Ahram and wrote for the state newspapers. Okay. The other interesting thing that happened in 2003. Sorry, I'm going to take off my watch and time this. If I'm still speaking in 15 minutes, can someone just throw something at me? Something sort of soft, but also tangible? Okay.
Half a bottle of water.
Yes, that'll actually, if you drink just like a little bit more of it and then throw it at me, that'd be cool. So the other thing that happened in 2003 was this heavily authoritarian regime led by Hosni Mubarak that had been in power since the assassination of Sadat in 1981, who had been in power since, you go back in time. Okay, this regime's been around since 1952. They legalized a couple of independently owned newspapers and gave licenses to them. One of them was called Ad-Dustur. The other, I think more important, was called Al-Masri Al-Yawm. And these are newspapers that more closely resembled actual newspapers that we would recognize here in the West. That is, newspapers that do reporting on political issues that are not necessarily constrained by what the government tells them to do and to not do. Okay, so these two things developed. They happened at the same time. Okay, the bloggers themselves. I once spoke to a guy that calls himself, I don't know whether he really is, calls himself the father of Egyptian blogging. It's really, you should let other people call you that. But anyway, I spoke to him in 2008. And I asked him, he started a website in the 90s called Cairo Live, which was like, standard issue GeoCities website with just a bunch of text on the screen and just sort of disorganized. And I asked him, this is the 90s, he started doing this, right? Barely anyone was online in Egypt at this time. And I said, what is it exactly that you were trying to do? And I thought his answer was very, very telling. Okay? And he said, and I think this goes for a lot of the bloggers who were doing work in Egypt in this time period, he said the goal was to re-engineer news priorities, right? That was to take things that the journalists, the mainstream journalists, the traditional journalists were not talking about, and this largely turned out to be things like torture, corruption, sexual harassment, succession issues between Mubarak and his son Gamal, re-engineer those news priorities so that people start talking about these things, right? Tariq Atiyah did not necessarily intend to overthrow the government when he started Cairo Live, okay? But those communities developed over time, and they did kind of help this happen. One of the interesting questions, again, you can see how I'm terrible at graphic design with the text on the thing there. I should have somebody look at my PowerPoints. So why, you might ask yourself, okay, if I showed you a chart of internet access in Egypt in this time period, there's very, very few people, especially in 2003. You're talking about maybe 10% of the population has any kind of internet access at all, right? So you might ask, how are you arguing that people doing digital activism had this effect on politics if hardly anybody was reading the blogs in the first place? And a lot of people that were reading the blogs were like people in the West, okay, especially at first. And the answer to that question was a very close collaboration between the journalists at these newspapers that I was just telling you about, these newly independent newspapers, and the digital activists themselves, many of whom, in fact, were journalists or former journalists or people who had been stringers for places like the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle. They had journalism experience. But what they did with that journalism experience was they became what they called blogger activists. Okay? And their job was to go out into the street to document things that were happening, and report them on the blogs. And the blogs, as I believe was mentioned earlier, became a kind of a source of information for the traditional journalists. Okay? They worked hand in hand. And these issues that were really swept under the carpet throughout the entire Mubarak period, they started to talk about them. So for instance, I interviewed a young woman named Noha Atif, who started a blog called Torture in Egypt, Azib fi Masr. Okay? And what she would do, torture is a really endemic practice in Egypt, still is, unfortunately. You can be taken off the street by the police at any time, taken away, beaten, tortured, raped, whatever, and they'll just kind of drop you off back at home and say, like, you know, it's been a pleasure knowing you. And nobody, you know, if you go back into the newspaper archives of the 80s and 90s, you will not find a lot of writing about torture, okay, because it's not something that you write about. You would be arrested for writing about the torture that was happening to other people. One of the things that was really key about the digital activists in Egypt at this time was they were not really willing to observe these so-called red lines of journalism. They were like, I don't, you know, go ahead, throw me in jail, arrest me, torture me, beat me up. I don't care, I'm gonna write about this anyway, right? So you have to appreciate the sort of incredible courage that it took for Noha to go around. And what she did was she interviewed people who had been tortured. She got them on video to name the people that had tortured them, and then she put the names and pictures of the police officers who had done the torturing up on the internet and said, like, this is where they live, right? These are the officers that did this torture, okay? And in several notable cases that I don't really have time to talk about, the bloggers broke these stories of people being tortured and kind of led them into the mainstream press. Okay, so it was this very small digital elite is doing the writing about these issues and then introducing those things to the mainstream journalists, who then transmit that information and that thinking to broader audiences, people who can't afford an internet connection but can afford to buy a newspaper on a street corner. Okay, so. This is kind of what's happening, I'd say, between 2003 and 2008. These guys are all also working with an opposition organization, a social movement called Kifaya, which means enough in Egyptian Arabic. And that's the group that starts to make the political demands that you see expressed in 2011. Okay? That is an end to the military state of emergency that had governed Egypt uninterrupted between 1981 and 2011. We want real democratic elections, right? We want economic reform. We want changes in foreign policy. All these things are first articulated in the early 2000s by this opposition group called Kifaya, who are also organizing their street rallies through digital means, in part, with the bloggers. You with me so far? I'm talking fast. So again, in 2003, blogging is the only game in town, okay? And this is hard to believe, but in 2003, there was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was no YouTube. There was no Dailymotion. There was none of this stuff, right? There was Blogspot, and that was it. You know, there were a couple other things emerging, but the sort of digital ecology that we understand today did not exist when the people that overthrew the Egyptian government started doing their work. Blogs were all that were happening, okay? By the time I started doing my research in Egypt in 2007, 2008, this was really changing sort of like in front of me as I was in Egypt. As I was interviewing people, they were like, actually, blogs are like totally yesterday's news, just so you know. And I was like, okay, I'll just write a different dissertation, that's cool. And they were like, you know, we're all moving to Twitter, and we're all moving to Facebook, and this is what's happening, okay? The bloggers had started to refer to themselves as power bloggers. They thought of themselves as directing the Egyptian activist opposition movement. And they were starting to use these new tools that we're obviously very familiar with today, but that were still kind of like cool and edgy in 2008, particularly the group formation function of Facebook and the idea of tweeting at all, which of course at the beginning everybody thought was extremely silly, and now it's all anybody can talk about. So the point is, there were a lot more people online in 2008. Okay? Internet access has gone up to about 20%. You have all of these other applications which the activists are using to do the same kind of things they were doing before, just in a more efficient, more networked fashion. Okay? And it's in 2008 is another kind of a turning point for Egyptian activism and for the ultimate events of the Arab Spring. Okay, this is when a group called the April 6 movement, or the April 6 Youth Movement, forms. I got to do a kind of a cop-style ride-along with them on their first action on April 6, 2008, which was a total accident. Somebody else put me in touch with them, but it was really cool. I was with the group that was writing about what was happening, and we were going from internet cafe to avoid getting arrested, and we didn't get arrested, so that was great. They were striking in solidarity with a labor group in Mahalla, which is a city north of Cairo. These are striking textile workers, and this is the beginning of some collaboration between these sort of elite, somewhat wealthy activists, again, largely based in Cairo, and then other social movements around the country that are just as, if not more important than the work that the activists were doing in Cairo. So they asked everybody to stay home, wear black on April 6, 2008, while the workers were striking, and then sort of, I thought paradoxically, to then go out and protest in downtown Cairo, like later in the day, but still wear black and not buy anything. Okay, so, and I thought very interestingly, and almost immediately, the April 6th movement adopted the raised fist, right, which is an icon of some of the color revolutions in the early 2000s in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, right? These are tactics that were deliberately diffused by activists who were like sort of transnational trainers. The April 6 people got trained by veterans of Otpor, which is a Serbian opposition group that helped overthrow the Milosevic regime in 1999. Okay, so it's all linked in a way. The strike itself, you know, Cairo was not shut down in the exact way that the activists wanted it to be, but it did lead to the formation of this group. Okay? Within a few days of the April 6 group forming on Facebook, like they formed this group, within a few days, 70,000 people had joined this group. Again, in today's numbers, that doesn't sound that sexy, but in 2008, that was actually about 10% of all Egyptians on Facebook at the time had joined the April 6 movement and promised to stay home and strike on April 6, 2008, right? So while it may have looked like a temporary defeat and the attempts to follow up that strike were not immediately successful, what they were able to do was to kind of keep the momentum going in terms of the organization. Right? That is, it became not just this Facebook group, but a group of sort of loosely linked, non-hierarchical organizations working together towards the same goals as Kifaya had been, because this opposition group Kifaya had sort of died out by 2008, because after running the same protests over and over and not succeeding, people got a little bit weary of not winning, you know? So I'm going to get to events that you may more closely have heard of at this point. That is the summer of 2010 and the killing of a man named Khaled Said in the port city of Alexandria. Mr. Said had committed an act of what we call surveillance, that is the watching of the watchers by the watched. He had taken a video of police dividing a drug bust. You can actually go and watch this video. It's actually, to me, a little bit ambiguous exactly what's happening in this video. But anyway, it was purported to be evidence that police were, you know, dividing up a drug bust amongst themselves and taking home the proceeds. And okay, so Said posts this video to his blog, and the next day he's dragged out of an internet cafe and beaten to death in full view of hundreds of horrified onlookers. Actually, they didn't beat him to death right away. They beat him half to death, and then they took him to the police station and finished beating him to death over the next couple of days. And then they did what's sort of hallmark of Mubarak-era authoritarianism, which is to claim that up is down. When they released his body to his family, and I won't put this up here because this is a family event, but there's pictures of this if you Google it. You can see how badly he was beaten, and the police said to his family, "I'm really sorry, but your son died swallowing a bag of marijuana." Which is a very extremely bizarre claim anyway, right? Even if his face had not been disfigured, I've never heard, it's a very strange way to die. So this was obviously untrue and obviously false. And it was the kind of thing that may have gone sort of unnoticed 10 years prior to that. But because you had this, again, loosely linked group of activists working on the same issues, they immediately seized on this issue. And a few of them formed a group called We Are All Khaled Said, which is another Facebook group dedicated to the memory of this man and dedicated to undertaking protest activities for the rest of the summer of 2010 and into the fall. The officers who committed this crime actually were arrested, and the prosecution at this point is still sort of vaguely up in the air, in part because of complications from the revolution. But the date of the January 25th, 2011 uprising, that is when Egyptians first went out into the streets, the plotting for that choice took place openly on the wall of this group. And if you have several hours of free time on your hands and like Mad Men is not on, you can actually go in and click on the previous post thing until the end of time, and you can get to the entries in January 2011 where they were like, should we have a protest? Because the Tunisians had just overthrown their government. And they were like, we should have a protest. We totally should. Yeah, I don't know, this day is cool. They're like, how about January 25th? You know what it is? It's Police Day. And Police Day was supposed to commemorate the role of the Egyptian police in overthrowing the hated British overlords in 1952, and had turned into sort of like Orwellian you know, like it's a day dedicated to the police, but everyone hates the police because the police are the ones that take them away and torture them in prison and throw them back onto the street, beaten up and dead, right? So they're like, what a great day. It's also a national holiday. So they're like, this is a great idea, right? Everybody's off, we can protest. Maybe we can do Tunisia here. Okay? This was all openly plotted by these veteran digital activists online, many of whom had been doing this work for 10 years or longer, in fact, with the same leaders, people that you may see in the news today because they're being thrown into prison again, unfortunately. All I wanted to make clear was that this was not like something that appeared out of the clear blue sky on January 25th, 2011. This was a social movement. It happened over a long period of time, and it was really assisted by the proliferation and the development of social media applications, the growing density of networks in Egypt itself, the greater number of people who were online, and of course all of the sacrifices that took place in the years up to 2011 to bring the issues that drove that revolt into the public sphere and sort of out of hiding, right? Again, torture, succession, political rights, economic inequality, things like that, okay? And this is, again, just a thing that I made on PowerPoint, but you can see, again, the development of these things is much denser, much more complicated than it was in 2003. Okay. And when I went back to Egypt in the summer of 2011 to interview, I unfortunately could not be there because I was teaching for the actual revolution, but I went back and I interviewed many of the principals of the revolution itself. One of the activists said, kind of what happened on in that period was a bit complicated, but we created the crisis. We did, right? The digital activists created the crisis. It's not necessarily completely our doing that Mubarak stepped aside, but we created the crisis, which of course resulted in Hosni Mubarak stepping aside and a seeming process of democratization being initiated in February 2011, okay? I'm gonna skip 3 years of history and just talk about what's happening in Egypt today and try to contextualize it a little bit. We have what looks to be a return to hard authoritarianism in Egypt. So we have this extremely hopeful moment or period of time from February 2011 until, it depends on when you want to say, like last summer or the summer before. And unfortunately today, things, in my humble opinion, look worse than ever. To use a paraphrase Office Space, like every day is the most depressed I've ever been about Egypt in my whole life. But the upshot of this is that a member of the Egyptian military is likely to win a fake presidential election in this May. And so in effect, the old regime has slightly reshuffled itself, but has put an end to the democratic experiment that unfolded over the past couple of years, and is likely to continue to rule in a non-democratic fashion for the foreseeable future. Unless, of course, someone does something about it. And you might ask, right, if the digital activists were so successful and played such a big role in the initial uprising that got rid of Mubarak, you know, why have they been so unable to have their will carried out in the years since then? Okay? This is an incredibly depressing picture of one of the people I interviewed, who's the co-founder of the April 6th movement, who's currently in prison awaiting charges of organizing illegal protests in Cairo. Okay? Here's a short answer. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to just run through it. One of the key things that happened, particularly in Egypt, was that the state saw the things that the digital activists were doing and they let it happen. Okay. In a lot of the states of this region, there was extensive filtering, censorship of the internet, execution of activists, things like that. All the Egyptian government ever really did was occasionally throw somebody into prison and beat them up and let them back out. Okay. This is a great mystery, social science mystery, things of which dissertations are made. Okay. Why did they do that? We don't really know. All I know is that both the Egyptian sort of military regime and its core have recognized their error and are making very sincere attempts to discourage activism by running a series of high-profile trials of activists like Ahmed Baher and like Ala Abdel Fattah, who really is probably the godfather of Egyptian blogging. Okay? A lot of these activists made the mistake of backing the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood government this past summer, which turned out to be just kind of a Trojan horse for the return of really hard Egyptian military rule, which was an understandable mistake because the Brotherhood was up to no good, generally speaking, but they might have seen that coming better. I just spent a month in Jordan, and there's a very palpable sense in Jordan and many other parts of the Middle East and this is going back to Deen's talk, that we do not want to see the Syria scenario unfold anywhere else in this part of the world. So there are a lot of people, I think, who are willing at this point to put their faith back into authoritarian rulers to avoid the Syria catastrophe, which has become a kind of a negative demonstration effect for democracy all over the region. Okay? And again, we have all of these new laws criminalizing dissent, changing press laws in Jordan, particularly changing protest laws in Egypt, right? The authoritarians are learning from their mistakes that these activists who did all of these things publicly are also very vulnerable to repression if the state apparatus is clever enough to respond to them in effective ways. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can have a good discussion here. Thank you.
I'd add, David, in part answer to your question of why are we where we are now, I would argue that part of this is what you guys didn't discuss very much, and that is the role of mass media as well. Certainly under Mubarak, at some level, the Mubarak regime believed its own media, even while the increasingly shall we say, independent media were saying one thing, the state media was still saying another. And to a large degree, the Mubarak people believed that and believed that things couldn't change. And then, as you said, that quick period where suddenly we had the Muslim Brotherhood in place, and the digital activists and the other opposition figures made that fatal mistake of saying, well, we elected this guy, but he's ruining the country. We don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in charge. So they bought into the idea. They called for the idea of a military coup, which obviously was the most naive thing they could have done. And so we're in this place. And media in Egypt now, mass media I'm talking about, as well as across the Arab world, have again become weapons of war, weapons of these conflicts. And where we had in Egypt the rise of a semi-independent media increasingly in the mid to late 2000s, with the government increasingly allowing new satellite channels, Egyptian-based satellite channels, to be given licenses. So you had an increasing plethora of other voices. As soon as Sisi took over, he shut down all of those that were allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, and at the same time, most of those other semi-independent TV stations fell into lockstep with the regime. So now, I mean, you talk about being depressed by Egypt every day. I mean, I watch journalists who I helped to train when I was at the American University in Cairo, and people who were friends, leaders of the kind of independent journalism movement in Egypt, who now are just mouthpieces for the regime. And the media has become so jingoistic in Egypt that there is no other voice, and as you say, and then the digital activists are largely being silenced. And then something similar but different is happening in Syria, where that Twitter cluster that you showed of English language media retweeting other tweets about Syria is emblematic of the fact that the Western media is largely unable to cover Syria. And so since there are few Western reporters in Syria, they are relying heavily on this waterfront of social media sources. Some are Syrian freelance journalists or those who have kind of become journalists. Many of those are representatives of the rebel movements and the government. And so this cacophony of unfiltered information coming out of Syria that the Western media and to a large extent Arab satellite broadcasters, pan-Arab broadcasters as well, are reliant on. So from the beginning in Syria, when journalists immediately became a target, Western and Arab satellite channels became dependent on the rebel organizations and the government in terms of getting pictures of what was going on and getting information about what was going on and facing a huge challenge of who do we believe? And they set up elaborate processes to determine what they would re-report, would repeat, what of these pictures they would show, down to doing things like, initial pictures came in, who in the newsroom is from this town in Syria? Do you recognize that? It's supposedly out of Aleppo. Do you recognize the buildings? Are they in Aleppo? Or using Google Images to figure out whether that was the right place. And then looking at what time of day was this supposedly taken, and where would the shadows have been at that time of day? Yes, all of this matches up, so I guess we can report that we've gotten this out of Syria with caveats. So Western media has become hobbled in terms of covering Syria, and so hence this huge influence of the Syrian Twitterati. And at the same time in Egypt, media have become voices of the regime. And this isn't just in these two countries that we see this. I mean, I'm just finishing up writing up a big survey in Pakistan. And this is exactly what's happening in Pakistan as well. Right, just the other day, a leading Pakistani TV host there was an assassination attempt. And the Pakistani media are completely divided in this media war, shouting at each other. One side saying it was government intelligence, another side saying it was others. You're smearing government intelligence. So this media war, this phenomenon of media not being independent or at any level objective, but being weapons of these various wars, is a phenomenon we see across the Arab world and the broader Bush's greater Middle East and the broader Muslim world. So I'll leave my comments there. Do we have questions for our panel? We must have some questions. All right, well, let me ask Deen a question. Those fragmented communities that you saw, those clusters, obviously there's the language clusters, and then there's presumably the pro and anti-regime clusters. What other key clusters emerged?
So it's as you say. One of the things that I did that I was not able to show was that I was able to, over the 32-month period, figure out which clusters were most persistent. So in other words, the cluster identification process proceeds stepwise. So you start in January 2011, and then you say, okay, so here's the 10 clusters in January 2011. Here are the 10 clusters in February 2011. Which of these are recognizable in terms of being identifiable in the first month to the second month, and from the second to the third, and from the third to the fourth, and all the way down the line till the end. And so the ones that were the most persistent over that time were, so there was the English language one that I showed you. That was actually the one that appeared in the single highest number of months. That actually appeared in most months. It was absent in a few. There were actually, I think, 3 that were based in Kuwait, which was very interesting. So one of the reasons for this is that Kuwait's internet penetration is quite high. And there are a lot of people in Kuwait who are, I wish Mark was here to parse this a bit more, Mark Lynch, who knows a bit more about this region than I do. But I think most of the folks that were in these Kuwaiti clusters were anti-Assad, and so they were trying to support various factions that were fighting against Assad. So
there's a lot of Kuwaiti money coming out and supporting the rebel movement.
Yeah, exactly. And indeed, many of the posts that constituted these clusters were solicitations for material support, so not only money but also in-kind donations, and a few calls to actually join, the fight in Syria. So there were a number of Syria clusters. I think there were 3 that were identifiable. I think the threshold was over 5 months at least. There was one that was based in Saudi Arabia around a television station called Al Wasal, which again is anti-Assad. There was only one actually that we found that was pro-Assad. So these are folks that are sort of a coalition of folks that support the Assad regime for various reasons and are very much
one in Saudi or one in general?
This was in general.
Okay.
This is distributed. I think there are some that are in Syria, some that are sort of regional, and then there are a couple other ones. Those are the major ones. And then the other interesting thing is when you look just at the English language ones, those sort of pop in and out as Syria kind of projects itself onto the major news phase. So there's a bunch of English ones in the beginning during the Arab Spring, and there's a bunch around the time that Obama is trying to figure out whether he's going to bomb Syria. And at that time, even though they don't persist a whole lot of times, you see, there was one that was based in the UK, so it was a UK news cluster. you see sort of the liberal and conservative American clusters that you see in more general analyses of online political conversation in the States. And so now they're sort of pre-existing in terms of talking about other issues, but hey, Syria is the issue now, so let's all talk about that. And so those sort of kind of flicker in and out over time, as opposed to sort of paying sustained attention to the issue.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about what David was talking about. All this was sort of percolating on social media well before their actual revolution. And then I'm also thinking about what we know, what the NSA is doing now, sweeping up all this information and lots more and analyzing it all. So why is it that the US government was caught so flat-footed on this? Were they just not paying attention to what's going on in social media at the time, or what? Or do you know?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think the data collection by the NSA was not really meant to predict the Egyptian revolution necessarily, right? It was largely focused on sort of like domestic terrorism or international terrorism, right? So the activists, well, interestingly, I think the activists flew under the radar of the Egyptian regime because they didn't take them seriously. And it may have flown under the radar of sort of intelligence folks because they were doing something else with their time. But I will say that people that I spoke to, people that worked for places like the open source folks inside the CIA and the people in the CIA, they like when I speak even in 2008, 2009, 2010, they knew as much as, if not more, about these activists than I did. So they were aware. They were definitely aware of what was going on in Egypt. But I think, like many people, I think they may have underestimated the capabilities of this group of people to carry out sort of the things that they were saying that they would do. Because the pattern over many years in Egypt was that we would call for protests, right? And the same 100 people would show up to protest, and they'd be surrounded on all sides by these black-clad riot police, and they would protest, and then people would get beaten up, and everybody would go home, and it became after a while kind of like theater, right? And it was like the boy who cries wolf. After the 500th protest that these activists called, everybody was like, well, why is this going to be any different than the last time, right? And there's kind of a complicated answer to that question, but I think that's one of the reasons why nobody saw it coming. Because also, if you look at many of the sort of Western commentators who were talking about this, say circa December 2010, when we saw what happened in Tunisia, the primary response from Western journalists, like folks like Tom Friedman, was like, this will never happen in Egypt, right? Because the assumption being that the Egyptian regime was so strong that it was effectively unchallengeable. So there was a very strong, tendency to assume that the successful perpetuation of authoritarianism would continue in spite of all of these efforts.
There's also this stereotype of Egyptians that they'll complain but they'll never act. I heard this for decades in the Middle East, that they'll put up with anything, they'll bitch and moan a little bit, but they'll put up with it. The activist and the fact that there was huge frustration and anger, et cetera, building up in Egypt, and B, that you had this very small, and we're talking a small cluster of digital activists, that they existed and they were active, was not a secret to anyone. As a matter of fact, the center I ran, we got $1 million in USAID money to train these activists in journalistic techniques, to bring them to the US, to cover the Obama election, et cetera. So they were, in no way were they under the radar. And then once it all started happening, you had this amazing situation of the White House, amazing on one level, not surprising on another, but the White House not stepping in and not overtly calling for Mubarak's ouster. I'm not saying they should have, but that was happening at one level, while on another level, the State Department was funding and working with Google to find ways for the activists to get around the fact that the plug had been pulled on the internet in Egypt. And so they set up phone lines in Europe. They could call in on landlines, and automated systems so that their tweets they'd dictate a tweet, it would automatically be posted on Twitter. So you had one branch of the US government being standoffish and another overtly fostering what they were doing.
What trends or parallels do you see here in the United States? As an example, this Bundy thing a few weeks ago, all of a sudden a lot of people showed up. how did that happen relative to social media?
You want to take that?
So,
So you talk about the Moral Monday thing in North Carolina. That's one. Which one is this? Nevada. Oh, Nevada. Oh, I never even heard of that one. So are you talking about social media and protests in general? Yeah. Oh, well, I think there are a number of parallels. Actually, I was talking to a woman on the drive over here, and she was saying, "Oh, well, isn't social media just sort of a distraction from other types of protests, and don't people really have to be in the streets, and isn't this something that's really taking away from the real activism?" And I told her that one of the main findings from our research, mine and other people's, is that people tend not to use social media in a vacuum when it comes to politics and activism. So when you find people who do use social media for activist and political purposes, odds are they're also acting in political ways that are not related to social media. So in other words, it tends to be just one other tool that is used for activist purposes. If you're really interested in this topic, my doctoral advisor has just written a book about it. It's called The Logic of Connective Action, as a play on the logic of collective action, which was a famous book on this written in the 60s by Mansur Olson. And so the idea is, his idea is that there are some forms of action that are heavily managed by organizations. There are some that are kind of, leaderless, or where structure develops as an outgrowth of digital media itself. And then there are some that are sort of in the middle of that, sort of organizationally kind of coached, but there's also a great degree of structure that emerges organically from the use of digital media. And so the test cases there are global things. There are things like Occupy. There's the Indignados movement in Spain. He also talks about some environmental protests that were held in the UK, as well as some protests around organic food and these sorts of things. And so I do think that social media is becoming one of the tools that is being widely used to foment protest, but I think it's sort of a mistake to look at that by itself, because it exists within an ecosystem of other tools whose goal ultimately, whose goal is to produce some form of social change. And I think the people that are working on this are going to use all of the means at their disposal, of which social media is only one.
The recent documentary, The Square, talked about, Tahrir Square, and the importance of having a focal point for the West to use their media, and then for these bloggers to meet together. Do you think that it's a necessity to have a place like this in Arab countries to focus on revolution?
Well, not just Arab countries. I mean, yeah. Oh, sure. The question was.
Try to pass around this microphone if you have a question.
The question was, you've all heard of Tahrir Square, the central square in Egypt where the main protests took place. And the question was, is it important in the Arab world to have a central place like that, and particularly so that the Western media and other media can focus on it? And my quick response before I go to them is that that's true anywhere, because media, and I say this as putting on my journalist hat, we're fickle, and if it's all spread out and all over the place and it's hard to cover, we're not going to cover it. If it's right there and all centralized and we can go in and set up the satellite trucks, et cetera, makes it real easy, and so we're going to go there and cover it. And obviously, if you have a protest, you want a focal point for the protest. And whether it's Tahrir Square, or we're seeing the same thing in Kiev, we saw it in Prague, et cetera, et cetera.
I would just say, just to really quickly add to that, totally agree with everything you said, but I also think there's a danger in predictability for the activists themselves. You see this in Turkey right now, where we go to the same square over and over again, and then suddenly the government's like, okay, by the way, you can't come to the square anymore. And then it's like, well, what do we do now, right? Because oftentimes you're going to a very, the reason Tahrir Square is chosen is because it's a large, centrally located, but also symbolic place, right? Tahrir means freedom, right? And so you're going to Freedom Square. It's not an accident that a lot of these squares that people are protesting in all around the world are called Freedom Square in places where there is no freedom, right? So it's like the old joke about the National Democratic Party, which was the party that ruled Egypt for a long time, which is that the party was neither national nor democratic nor a party, right? And this is a square. It's not really. It's also not a square, but it's a large roundabout, right? That is not free. So I do think that it can be a problem for activists when they return to the same tactics in the same places over and over and over and over again, because it says to the state, like, hey, if you want to disrupt our protests, Guess where we're going to be? Yep, you got it. Tahrir Square. There we are.
Well, it's certainly back to your question about why isn't it, why did it all stop? I mean, Sisi and the army now are very cognizant of that, and they're not for the most part, letting people in and gather there. Did you want to add anything, Deen?
Yeah, just to follow up on what David said, and that is specifically that, the fact that, it can be predicted that people are going to go to the same square and protest in the same place really ups the ante for incentives for these activists to innovate. And their incentives specifically are to find ways to basically feed the media in ways that will project their message the farthest. And it's hard to predict what those are going to be, right? I mean, they want to be able to get their message out there, and so it seems like now we've sort of seen this mode where people are kind of going all to the same place and having the wonderful large aerial shots of everybody protesting. In the Egyptian Revolution, you had lots of people who were holding up signs, and many of those became memes. There was one of a guy who was holding a sign that said something to the effect of "Thank you, Facebook" or what have you, and that one circulated throughout a lot of the sort of the punditry that was talking about this. But that's already happened, and so if you really want to feed the media in a way that will get your message out really widely the next time, you need to do something else that will be novel and that will attract attention. And so I think that will really raise the stakes for activists to think of the next big thing that's really going to draw attention to their cause when the time arrives.
In the back? Yeah. You.
In regards to the Arab Spring, what were some of the larger factors that separated the success of one revolution versus another? Like, why was the Tunisian revolution different than what happened in Egypt, Syria, or what happened in Libya versus those cases?
Okay, tough one. Yeah.
Focus on the aspects.
Sorry, can I hide under the table now? No. Well, so I think one important thing that I feel a lot of people in my discipline have identified and looked at is civil-military relations. Okay, so if you take the Tunisian case, the Tunisian military did not necessarily see itself as intimately tied up with that regime, right? That is, the regime could go away, but the Tunisian military would sort of be able to do the same things that it was doing before. Also, the Tunisian military was not a corporate or commercial actor in the same way that some other militaries in the region are becoming. Okay, so that's one thing. The military looked at what was happening. So Ben Ali is becoming unpopular, and they said, like, well, do we really need this guy? Like, no, we don't, right? And they let him go. And that Tunisia still remains the most successful case of the Arab Spring, I think in part because of that separation. Whereas in places like Syria or Libya, the military is intimately tied up with a sort of ethnic politics of the regime. Okay? In Libya, that's a split between the east and west. In Syria, it's the Alawi minority, which is the ruling family. Assad are from a small sort of a smaller Islamic sect called the Alawis, although most Muslims will say they're not. Anyway, it's a long story. But the military is controlled by Assad. The state is controlled by Assad, and it's staffed with Alawis, right? So when the state is threatened, the military is threatened, right? Like all the institutions of the state are threatened at the same time. If you take one down, you take them all down, and we all lose power, right? So there was really no way for the military in Syria to say like, well, we could probably just get rid of Assad, right? Like, but that's not how it's going to work because that's not what the protesters were calling for. So there's some complicated ethnic politics in Syria that I think affected the failure of that transition, right? There's also just sort of like levels of authoritarianism to begin with, right? I mean, Syria was just a much worse, much harder authoritarian regime than the Egyptian. And the Egyptian regime was brutal enough, right? But the Syrian regime was just like another level of seriousness. And I think it's worth noting that we look at Libya as a kind of a success, but it's not clear. It's really not clear that the opposition would have won in Libya had not NATO unleashed the bombing, right? Which they have not done in Syria. So Syria might look really different if we had a Libya-style intervention. So there's those external factors at play too. I could go on about this for a long time. So
Yeah.
I'll just
Well, I mean, as a media scholar, I would also look at two other factors. The first of which is internet penetration. The other of which is internet and media policy. So, I think that you have to have this is on some level common sense, right? You have to have a certain level of internet penetration in order for the internet to actually make a difference. So in Egypt at the time of the revolution, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, David, but I believe that the national internet penetration was about 20% by that point. And so that proved to be a level at which, so everybody didn't have it, right? So in fact, a majority didn't. But there was a bit of a diffusion process wherein you had the people that were the elite folks that were, affiliated with Kafaya and all of this, that were able to diffuse the information that they got from the internet to everybody else. And so that critical mass was there for that to happen. Now, compare that to something like Libya, where internet penetration at the time was less than 5%. And so that is one of the reasons why the internet itself was less of a factor there. There were other factors and there were other media that led people, to do what they did and led Libya to head into the very different situation, a military situation that it headed into. Syria's internet penetration was similarly low. And the other aspect is a sort of media policy. So there's this question of, so in Tunisia, this is a great example. There was much more of a freer flow of information that happened in Tunisia, right? I think anybody who paid attention to the Arab Spring in Egypt is aware of the fact that toward the end of January in 2011, Mubarak shut the internet all the way down, right? It's an extremely heavy-handed move that ultimately backfired. And so rather than using other types of filtering and policy that might have limited, in years prior, might have limited the ability of digital activists to connect. And so I think those are, there's a lot more to say about that, but I think those are two other factors that you might want to look at in addition to the ones David mentioned.
And regional politics come into play. You have, in Syria, you have a division within the region, within the other players in the region. It ties into the whole, essentially, Cold War between the Sunnis and the Shia, between the Gulf Arabs and Iran. And then you look at a place like Bahrain, which has high internet penetration, which has a relatively educated population, but you have the rest of the GCC, the Saudis and the Emiratis, send troops in because they don't want that regime to be toppled. So it's a complicated region, and there's a whole host of factors in each country that's different. In the back.
How about Turkey? What do you see developing in Turkey?
I'm not a Turkey expert because I don't speak Turkish, although I did just come back from Turkey. I can tell you that. No, I speak Arabic.
Oh, you do? Okay,
Yeah.
so it was Deen that didn't. Okay.
But so I don't know. All I can tell you is that the people I went to dinner with in Istanbul are like super depressed about Turkey, and I think you see a kind of an authoritarian drift in Turkey that reminds me of things that happened in, like, say, Russia in the early 2000s, where you have democratically elected leadership that arrogates more power to itself gradually over time in a way that maybe people don't even notice immediately, and then entrenches itself in power more or less permanently. I think that's the big fear coming out of Turkey right now. Interesting thing is that the protests last summer were not really about that. They were about economic inequality, or the state's plans to continue this like weird construction binge that Turkey is on, that's driving the whole economy right now, but that's fostering inequality. Right? The protests were not about Erdogan staying in power forever, but now it looks like that's exactly what he's going to do. So, it's worrisome. That's all I can say.
Just really quickly, Turkey is one of the most, I think, scared of what of all these regimes. They've sort of expressed the most fear about what is going on with the internet. So a couple weeks ago, Erdogan actually shut off access to Twitter because they were allowing all this terrible slander about I think it was something about the police corruption or something like this, and so they barred access to Twitter. Now there's ways to get around it. So you had this very strange situation in which you saw the Google DNS IP address being spray painted around around the country so that people could elude the country-level DNS block to be able to access various forms of social media. So there's that aspect. The other aspect is the fact that there's been talk, I don't know whether this is actually going to happen or not, but there has been talk of instantiating, and this would be a huge technical thing, so it may just be talk, about instantiating a national intranet that would be in Turkey that would be completely shut off from the rest of the internet, which seems like economic suicide to me, but a regime that's just crazy, might be just crazy enough to try it. And so these are just a couple of ways in which a lot of the communication that's happening on the internet even though a minority of it may be about activism and politics and whatever, can be just enough to freak an administration out into doing something really, really drastic that can have unknown consequences for the country's political system and economy.
And there's this strange situation there of the major force of opposition at the moment is another Islamist group that the chief is based here in the US. And so then that also gets into communications. And at the same time, Turkey has more journalists in jail than anywhere else in the region. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Just real quick, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in a place where the internet is blocked or a site on the internet is blocked, but it's like, it's real. You know, I was actually in Turkey a couple weeks ago, and you can't go to Twitter unless you know these workarounds, right? And most ordinary people are just gonna be like, well, I guess I'm not gonna use Twitter today, right? Which is what I did because I was staying at Airbnb and I didn't want to get my host in trouble. But it's easy to get around if you know how to get around it, but it does discourage a lot of people from doing what they were gonna do, right? Even if it's just a percentage.
In the back, the blue shirt.
Yes, I think I can talk loud enough without trying to figure out how this thing works. Do any of you have some views on the use of the chemical weapons? Because some of the indications are...
I'm against them.
Some of the indications are that some of the chemical weapons came very short distances to come to where they were landing. And so there was some idea that they came from terrorist groups and not from the government. Do you know anything about those things?
Anybody?
I actually am not sure. There was one thing that was really interesting in our data was, and this is probably just because I probably should know more about this, but unfortunately I don't. There were allegations of the use of chemical weapons on the part of the Syrian regime, I think at least a year or two before it became a major issue in the U.S. press. So you could see this on Twitter. People were making allegations about this, and so I hadn't been paying that much attention at the time, and so I was really interested to go back and say, oh wow, late 2011 and throughout 2012, people are sort of pushing this to the top of some of the, and this is only in English, right? Because I can't read Arabic, and so these, I think one of the things that happened was that people saw chemical weapons as a way of getting the West involved, right? So if, I can't really speak to the evidence, I'm not into that. I'm sure there's a whole lot we don't know about this, but I think that the rebels at least were well aware of the fact that there is this convention against it, and if we can prove or demonstrate to some degree of satisfaction that Assad is engaging in this behavior, then that's going to be so much better for us. And that did persist sort of out there in the Twitter sphere, and then reached critical mass in August 2013 when Obama considered but ultimately declined to intervene militarily in Syria.
And to add to another little fact, that the British had chemical weapons in Egypt during World War II, and some of those weapons ended up being used in Yemen way back. So how
This
much?
comes back to this fundamental issue of we don't get straight reporting coming out of Syria. There are very few Western journalists on the ground. You can't believe anything anyone tells you. So for us, for the general public, intelligence agencies is a different issue. But for the general public to convincingly say, yes, this is true, or no, this is not true, is essentially impossible, particularly in a region where there's a long track record of regimes using chemical weapons against their own people and opposition movements and various militias using, attacking, killing, staging massacres to make the other guy look bad. So there's lots of mirrors within mirrors. Another question?
I too can speak up louder too. It's on for 40 years. You switched off the subject of more or less the social media, but I was a bit curious as you moved into with your Egyptian expertise, and that's this, is that our government isn't particularly strong in speaking up when they had an opportunity in the conflict we talk about here the last 4 years. And I have to wonder about where you see a relationship between the United States and the Arab world, because it hasn't been very good in the past, and we still seem to be into the situation between Israel and the Arab world. Do you have any comments you want to make about the United States relationship to this?
Well, I mean, I'll take the first part of that question first, which is about the U.S. response to the events of the past. So I don't know if you meant sort of the uprising itself or the sort of the post-uprising period.
Right on from there, and the fact that as soon as the military took it over, they said that apparently they were happy with that.
Yeah. I mean, the Obama administration has been very, arguably perhaps too much cognizant of the unpopularity of the United States in the Arab world. Right, like they're very much aware of this problem, and they've, in many cases, tried to me, it seems like, I'm not in the Obama administration, but it seems like they have tried to calibrate policy carefully so as to avoid appearing to side with one group over another group in internal conflicts. In most, but the Syria, I think, is a kind of an exception to this, but to avoid the appearance of favoritism. And I think are hedging their bets. With the U.S., the Obama administration has been hedging its bets a little bit, I think particularly with Egypt, about who is ultimately going to come out on top in this ongoing struggle. Okay, so during the sort of the uprising period, you had the Obama administration looked like kind of like it was on its heels a little bit, didn't know what to do or say, didn't know whether to publicly back the protesters or issue a statement of support for Mubarak, who after all was an ally of the U.S. for all 30 years of his tenure. But as things developed, you could kind of see the transformation taking place where, the Obama administration didn't feel like it could go out publicly and say like, yeah, why don't you go out into the square and smash those kids, right? In the period since then, again, when the Muslim Brotherhood comes into power, you have the Obama administration publicly willing to work with them, while still keeping some distance from the group and their ideology and their aims, because they wanted to, I think, they would rather not have seen them come to power, but they also wanted to avoid the appearance of looking like they were against the Muslim Brotherhood, which might alienate Muslims.
Against democracy.
Or against democracy, yeah. So they're walking a tightrope in Egypt, right? And I think as the security situation in Egypt has deteriorated, you've seen sort of a persistent willingness on the part of the Obama administration to overlook some of the nastier things that this government is now doing, because like the Sinai Peninsula is falling apart, right? There's a power vacuum there. There's jihadis coming in from elsewhere. There's all sorts of unpleasant things happening in Egypt that could lead to very dark places. And now I think the Obama administration is sort of come around to the idea that like, well, we don't really have a choice but to support these guys right now.
Epitomized by the fact that today the White House announced we're sending Apache helicopters to the Egyptian military. Yeah. So.
Okay, I'm afraid our time is up, but before I ask you to thank our guests, I want to invite all of you across the hall. Right after this, we're going to have a little reception. Reward for coming out on a cold afternoon. We have some wine, some cheese over there, so you're all welcome to come on over and speak to our guests and continue the conversation over there. Now, on behalf of the Foley Institute and on behalf of the Murrow College of Communication, I want to thank all of you for coming out, and join me now in thanking our panelists for a very interesting